shutting down airliners, poisoning dissidents, interfering in elections, spying, and hacking have long seemed to be the Kremlin's daily business. And the question, repeatedly put to long-term observers of Russia like me, was, what is it all for? Why does Russia consistently behave like this? And what does it achieve? This book tries to put the pieces of the jigsaw together, to explain how and why Russia pushes for more power and influence wherever it can reach, far beyond Ukraine, and what it means, not just for governments, but for ordinary people. It brings together stories from the military, politics, diplomacy, espionage, cyber power, organized crime, and more, to describe how Moscow conducts its campaigns across the globe, and how nobody is too unimportant to be caught up in them. I try to lift the lid on the daily struggle going on behind the scenes to protect governments, businesses, societies, and people from Russian hostile activity, and in doing so, to show how Russia's aims and objectives are far broader and more ambitious, and the ways it tries to reach them far more pervasive and damaging than most people can see from media headlines. In a way, this follows on from a book I wrote in 2019 called Moscow Rules. That book dug deep into the underlying factors that have driven Russia to be so permanently hostile to the West throughout the centuries, and explained some of the reasons behind Russian actions today that so many of us find incomprehensible, like the assault on Ukraine and the atrocities committed during it. It's still the case that many of the methods the current Russian government is applying draw from its past experience in manipulating and controlling both its own people and politicians and government officials abroad. Almost everything Russia does that is described in both this book and the previous one is recognizable from previous centuries, just updated as new technology for delivering malign effects becomes available. But while Moscow Rules dealt with why Russia attacks the West, this book looks instead at how it does so, and in particular how that affects not just governments and politicians and the armed forces, but a much broader range of people. And importantly, these are often people who might think that because they don't have the slightest interest in Russia, Russia isn't interested in them. Unfortunately, as we see over and over again in the book, this simply isn't true. To show how this works, the book is filled with first-person stories of what it means to face up to Russia. About the eyewitnesses. Where possible, I've tried to tell stories that are not well known. There's no shortage of books, articles, and studies explaining individual aspects of how Russia gets its way in great detail, and I wanted to add to them, not to repeat them. So you won't find in this book long and detailed descriptions of how Russia used its little green men to seize Crimea, or shot down Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17, or is using mercenaries to attempt to rebuild its power and influence in Africa, or attempted to murder Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. All these events and others like it appear in the book, of course, but they are punctuation for a much bigger and longer story. Even the immense and still unfolding tragedy of the war on Ukraine forms just one case study among many. So, some obvious candidates who could tell us a lot about the impact of Russia's actions only feature in passing in this book. Victims of Russia's assault on Ukraine have suffered the most direct and obvious consequences of Moscow's aggression, but their harrowing stories are already well established in the public eye. There are many other previous victims, too, who are not included. The family of Dawn Sturgis, for example, who died as a result of Russian intelligence officers' carefree handling of deadly poison in Salisbury in 2018, have suffered enough, and there is no need to ask them to tell their story again. I've also purposely not included interviews with people from organizations like the Bellingcat investigative group, who you might think would be one of the obvious candidates, given how effective they have been in exposing Russian activities. But Bellingcat, too, is already sufficiently well known. What I wanted to show instead was that behind every high-profile story that reaches the national media in one of the countries targeted by Russia, there are a dozen other stories below the surface that affect real people's lives but never reach public attention.